Coffee, coffee. It's 8th VR 5786, Saturday, April 25th. Fuck, I gotta do that thing. Oh, fuck. This shit is the worst. His mom was documentary last night. And this motherfucker was like, motherfucker, fuck. And people love that shit. So they're gonna fucking queef when they see a rabbi doing it. West Side. Really? Dog, this is the. Oh, this is. Sucks. 120 days of this shit. No one really knows for sure Eluvei, Elu Divrei, Elokim, Chaim, but this is the Missouri live by. Berkat Adonai, Eloheinu Maklam, Asher Shana, B'mitzvot Vitzivanu, Al Sefrat HaOmer. Blessed are you, Hashem, our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 25 days, which is 3 weeks and 4 days of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash and to its place, speedily in our days of my celebration. But may the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash to its place, speedily in our days. Amen. Salah. Oh, I gotta do this. Alright, so what's that mean? It means today's shit's gonna be longer than normal. Why? Because it sucks. You know, Rabbi, you sure do. J started watching you. Go fuck yourself. Why would you watch me? I'm worst. Chabad timeline of Jewish history. Sick. Oh, are you fucking serious? Oh, fuck. Motherfucker. This is the worst. Fucking shit. This shit sucks. This is the worst. Stupid fucking shit. Stupid ass fucking internet bullshit. Alright, here's this bullshit. You really? It's the worst. West Side. West Side Park. What is this bullshit? Dude, remind me later. No one fucking cares, dog. This is the worst.
With our being taken into exile yet again.
Yo, do the
Jewish
thing
history
again.
spans nearly 6,000 years, beginning with the creation, approximately 4,000 years before the Common Era. It continues through the eras of the patriarchs, the Egyptian bondage, the judges, the First Temple era, when the kings of Judah and Israel ruled, the Babylonian exile, and the Second Temple era, which concluded with our being taken into exile yet again by the Romans. Throughout Torah study and
So what? 3761, creation of the world, Adam and Eve. 3761, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve, Chava. 3631, 130, Seth, son of Adam, was born. 3526, 235, Enosh, son of Seth, was born. 3436, 325, Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. 3366, Mahalalel, son of Kenan, was born. Bet that guy sucked. Bet he was the worst. You think you're related to him? I bet we're all fucking related to that douche. Really? I'm not related to everybody. Why? Why not? Why the fuck not? Don't suck. Alright, Mahalalel, son of Kenan, was born. No one cares.
our faith in GD and his promise of redemption were our constant companions, providing the Jewish people with a divine compass through every challenge and change. Which era would you like to jump to?
All of them.
Creation of heaven and earth, and Adam and Eve. The forefathers. Living in Egypt. Traveling through the desert. Judges and early prophets. Kings and the first holy temple. Exile in Babylon. Building of the second holy temple. Greek cultural domination. Kingdom of Judea, dynasty of the Shashmanaim. Roman client kings and rulers, the Herodian dynasty. The Talmudic era, the Mishnah. The Talmudic era, the Gemara. The Rabbanan. The Janim. The early Rishonim, the Crusade massacres. Later Rishonim, persecutions and expulsions. The great scholars of the Shulchan Aruch and Torah consolidation. Early Acharonim and East European massacres. Acharonim and early Hasidim. Later Acharonim and the changing society. The Holocaust. The modern state of Israel. Traveling through the desert. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 1313 2448 the Jewish nation crossed the Red Sea. Minus 1313 2448 the revelation at Mount Sinai and the giving of the Torah. Minus 1313 2448 Moses broke the tablets. Minus 1312 2449 Moshe came down Mount Sinai with the second tablets. Minus 1312 2449 the tabernacle was erected. Minus 1312 2449 the spies returned from Canaan with bad news. Minus 1274 2487 Aharon and Miriam died. Minus 1273 2488 Moses died. Exile in Babylon. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 423 3339 Gedaliah ben Achikam was killed. Minus 421 3340 Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar dream. Minus 410 3352 Ezekiel prophesied about the future by Hamadash. Minus 372 3389 Daniel read the writing on the wall. Minus 372 3389 Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. Minus 371 3390 Zerubbabel led the return to the land of Israel. Minus 373 391 building of second Beit Hamikdash commenced, then halted. Minus 366 3395 Akashverosh II made his great banquet. Minus 362 3399 Esther was taken to the palace. Minus 357 3404 Esther took action against Haman's decree. Minus 355 3406 Mordecai proclaimed the celebration of Purim. Minus 353 3408 building of the second Beit Hamikdash resumed. Minus 349 3412 the second Beit Hamikdash was completed. Greek cultural domination.
I knew this thing was off.
Timeline of Jewish history. Jewish history spans nearly 6,000 years, beginning with the creation.
I always knew, like, there's something weird. Alright.
Approximately 4,000 years before the Common Era. Creation of heaven and earth, and Adam and Eve. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 3,761 creation of the world. Birth of Adam and Eve, Shabbat. Minus 3,631 130 Seth, son of Adam, was born. Minus 3,526 235 Enosh, son of Seth, was born. Minus 3,436 325 Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. Minus 3,366 395 Mehalilel, son of Kenan, was born. Minus 3,301 460 Yer, son of Mehalilel, was born. Minus 3,139 622 Chanuk, son of Yer, was born. Minus 3,074 687 Metushalach, son of Chanuk, was born. Minus 2,887 874 Lamech II, son of Metushalach, was born. Minus 2,831 930 Adam died. Minus 2,705 1,056 Noah, son of Lamech II, was born. Minus 2,225 1,536 Noah began the construction of the ark. Minus 2,205 1,556 Japhet, son of Noah, was born. Minus 2,204 1,557 Cham, son of Noah, was born. Minus 2,203 1,558 Shem, son of Noah, was born. Minus 2,105 1,656 Metushalach died. Minus 2,105 1,656 the great flood covered the earth. Minus 2103 1658 Arpachshad, son of Shem, was born. Minus 2068 1693 Shalach, son of Arpachshad, born. Minus 2038 1723 Eber, son of Shalach, was born. Minus 2004 1757 Peleg, son of Eber, was born. Minus 1974 1787 Reu, son of Peleg, was born. Minus 1942 1819 Sirach, son of Reu, was born. Minus 1912 1849 Nacharai, son of Sirach, was born. Minus 1883 1878 Terah, son of Nacharai, was born. The forefathers. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 1813 1948 Abraham, son of Terah, was born. Minus 1803 1958 Sarah, daughter of Haran, was born. Minus 1788 1973 Abraham married Sarah. Minus 1765 1996 dispersion from Babel after building the tower. Minus 1761 2000 Terah left Ur Kasdim with his family. Minus 1755 2006 Noah died. Minus 1743 2018 The Covenant, Brit Bain Habitarim, with Abraham. Minus 1738 2023 Abraham settled in Canaan. Minus 1727 2034 Ishmael, son of Abraham, was born. Minus 1713 2048 Abraham circumcised himself and Ishmael. Minus 1713 2048 Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Minus 1713 2048 Isaac, son of Abraham, was born. Minus 1677 2084 the Acta, where Isaac was brought on the altar by Abraham. Minus 1677 2084 Sarah died. Minus 1653 2108 Jacob and Esau were born. Minus 1638 2123 Abraham died. Minus 1603 2158 Shem, son of Noah, died. Minus 1590 2171 Isaac blessed Jacob instead of Esau. Minus 1576 2185 Jacob went to Haran. Minus 1574 2187 Eber, great-grandson of Shem, died. Minus 1569 2192 Jacob married Leah and Rachel. Minus 1566 2195 Levi, son of Jacob and Leah, was born. Minus 1562 2199 Joseph, son of Jacob and Rachel, was born. Minus 1556 2205 Jacob left Haran. Minus 1553 2208 Benjamin was born. Minus 1545 2216 Joseph was sold. Minus 1533 2228 Isaac died. Minus 1532 2229 Joseph became viceroy of Egypt. Minus 1526 2235 Kahat, son of Levi, was born. Minus 1523 2238 Jacob, and his family, went to Egypt. Living in Egypt. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 1506 2255 Jacob died. Minus 1429 2332 after Levi died. The enslavement in Egypt began. Minus 1393 2368 Moses was born. Minus 1355 2406 Joshua was born. Minus 1314 2447 Moses encountered the burning bush. Minus 1313 2448 The Jewish nation left Egypt, traveling through the desert. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 1313 2448 The Jewish nation crossed the Red Sea. Minus 1313 2448 The revelation at Mount Sinai and the giving of the Torah. Minus 1313 2448 Moses broke the tablets. Minus 1312 2449 Moshe came down Mount Sinai with the second tablets. Minus 1312 2449 The tabernacle was erected. Minus 1312 2449 The spies returned from Canaan with bad news. Minus 1274 2487 Aharon and Miriam died. Minus 1273 2488 Moses died. Judges and early prophets. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 1273 2488 The Jews crossed the Jordan into Canaan. Minus 1258 2503 The appointment of the land of Israel was completed. Minus 1245 2516 Joshua died. Minus 1228 2533 The rule of judges began with Othniel ben Kenaz. Minus 1188 2573 Ehud ben Gera became leader. Minus 1107 2654 Shamgar ben Anath died. Minus 1107 2654 Deborah became leader. Minus 1067 2694 Gideon became leader. Minus 1027 2734 Abimelech, son of Gideon, became leader. Minus 1024 2737 Tola, son of Pua, became leader. Minus 1003 2758 Jadir, the Jaledite, became leader. Minus 982 2779 Jephthah, Hagiladi, became leader. Minus 969 2792 Elon, Hazabiloni, became leader. Minus 959 2802 Abdon ben Hillel became leader. Minus 951 2810 Samson became leader. Minus 931 2830 Eli the Cohen became leader. Minus 907 2854 David was born. Minus 892 2871 Samuel became leader. Kings and the First Holy Temple. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 879 2882 Saul was appointed king. Minus 877 2884 David became king of Judah in Hebron. Minus 869 2892 David became king of Israel in Jerusalem. Minus 837 2924 Solomon became king. Minus 833 2928 The building of the first Beit Hamikdash commenced. Minus 827 2935 The first Beit Hamikdash was completed. Minus 797 2964 Solomon died and his kingdom was divided. Minus 797 2964 Rehoboam, son of Solomon, became king of Judah. Minus 797 2964 Jeroboam ben Nebat became king over Israel. Minus 718 3043 Elijah went up in a chariot of fire. Minus 677 3084 Joash renovated the Beit Hamikdash. Minus 619 3142 Isaiah began his prophecies. Minus 574 3187 The first two of the 10 tribes were exiled. Minus 566 3195 Another two of the 10 tribes were exiled. Minus 562 3199 Hezekiah became king of Judah. Minus 556 3205 The last of the 10 tribes were exiled. Minus 548 3213 Sennacherib invaded the land of Judah and retreated. Minus 533 3228 Manasseh, son of Hezekiah, became king of Judah. Minus 463 3298 Jeremiah began his prophecies. Minus 458 3303 Josiah renovated the Beit Hamikdash. Minus 442 3319 Jerusalem was conquered and Jehoiakim, was exiled. Minus 443 3321 Jehoiakim burned the Book of Lamentations composed by Jeremiah. Minus 434 3327 Jerusalem was conquered again and Jehoiakim was exiled. Minus 433 3331 Jeremiah persisted in prophesying calamity. Minus 429 3332 Ezekiel prophesied in exile. Minus 425 3336 The final Babylonian siege of Jerusalem. Minus 423 3338 The walls of Jerusalem were penetrated. Minus 423 3338 The sacrifices ceased in the Beit Hamikdash. Minus 423 3338 The first Beit Hamikdash was destroyed. Exile in Babylon. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 423 3339 Gedaliah ben Achikam was killed. Minus 421 3340 Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar dream. Minus 410 3352 Ezekiel prophesied about the future Beit. Minus 372 3389 Daniel read the writing on the wall. Minus 372 3389 Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. Minus 371 3390 Zerubbabel led the return to the land of Israel. Minus 373 391 building of second Beit Hamikdash commenced. Then halted. Minus 366 3395 Akashverosh II made his great banquet. Minus 362 3399 Esther was taken to the palace. Minus 357 3404 Esther took action against Haman's decree. Minus 355 3406 Mordecai proclaimed the celebration of Purim. Minus 353 3408 building of the second Beit Hamikdash resumed. Minus 349 3412 the second Beit Hamikdash was completed. Building of the second Holy Temple. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 348 3,413 Ezra led the second return to the land of Israel. Minus 335 3,426 Nehemiah returned to rebuild walls of Jerusalem. Minus 313 3,448 Ezra died. Minus 313 3,448 Simon the Zodic met Alexander the Great. Minus 313 3,449 the Minyan Shtaro began. Greek cultural domination. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 273 3,488 Simon the Zodic died. Minus 246 3,515 72 elders translated the Torah into Greek, Septuagint. Minus 143,621 the revolt of Mattatyahu the Shashmanai. Kingdom of Judea. Dynasty of the Shashmanaim. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 139 3,622 Judah the Maccabee ruled. Minus 139 3,622 the second Beit Hamikdash was rededicated. Minus 138 3,623 Hanukkah was declared a festival. Minus 133 3,628 Judah the Maccabee was killed in battle. Minus 133 3,628 Yonatan, son of Mattatyahu, ruled. Minus 127 3,634 Shimon, son of Mattatyahu, ruled. Minus 119 3,642 Yohanan Harkanos, son of Shimon, ruled. Minus 93 3,668 Judah Aristobulus, son of Yochanan Harkanos, ruled. Minus 91 3,670 Alexander Yanai, son of Yochanan Harkanos, ruled. Minus 73 3,688 Queen Shalamzion, Salome Alexandra, wife of Alexander Yanai, ruled. Minus 65 3,696 Aristobulus II, son of Alexander Yanai, ruled/td. Minus 61 3,700 the Romans gained control of Judea. Minus 61 3,700 Harkanos II, son of Alexander Yanai, ruled. Minus 43,721 Antigonus, son of Aristobulus II, ruled. Roman client kings and rulers, the Herodian dynasty. Secular year Jewish year event in history. Minus 36 3,725 Herod I ruled, killing all the Shashmanaim. Minus 33 3,728 Hillel became the leader of the Torah scholars. Minus 19 3,742 Herod I began rebuilding the second Beit Hamikdash. Minus 11 3,750 renovation of the second Beit Hamikdash was completed. 1 3,761 Archelaus, son of Herod I, ruled. 8 3,768 Hillel died. 10 3,770 Archelaus was deposed by the Roman emperor. 21 3,781 Agrippa I, grandson of Herod I, ruled. 28 3,788 the Sanhedrin moved from the second Beit Hamikdash. 44 3,804 Agrippa II, son of Agrippa I, ruled. 53,810 Rabban Gamliel I, son of Shimon, grandson of Hillel, died. 66 3,826 Vespasian arrived in Judea to reassert Roman authority. 69 3,829 the second Beit Hamikdash was destroyed. The Talmudic era. The Mishnah. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 74 3,834 Ar Yohanan ben Zakkai died. 86 3,846 the Sanhedrin moved from place to place, under Ar Gamliel II. 133 3,893 Bader fell, and the Bar Kokhba revolt ended in tragedy. 134 3,894 Judaism was banned, and Ar Akiva was imprisoned. 189 3,949 Ar Judah Hanasi completed the Mishnah around this time. The Talmudic era. The Gemara. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 219 3,979 Rab left the land of Israel and settled in Babylonia. 247 4007 Shmuel was the Talmudic authority in Babylonia. 254 4014 Ar Yohanan was the leading Talmudic authority. 294 4050 Ar Huna was the leading Talmudic authority. 298 4058 Ar Yehuda was the leading Talmudic authority. 304 060 Ar Kista was the leading Talmudic authority. 309 4069 Rabbah was the leading Talmudic authority. 321 4081 Ar Yosef was the leading Talmudic authority. 325 4085 Abedi was the leading Talmudic authority. 338 4098 Rabbah was the leading Talmudic authority. 359 4119 Hillel II, who established the calendar, became Nasi. 392 4152 Ar Eshi was the leading Talmudic authority. 427 4187 of the Gemara. 135 the Talmud. was complete when Ravina II died. The Rabbanan. Secular year Jewish year event. 500. Academy of Pumbedita was 4,374. The Persians conquered the land of Israel. 614. 4,374. The Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. 629. 4,389. The Byzantine Empire reconquered the land of Israel. 636. 4,396. Aritzhak was the last Jayon of Nehardeh, Virashuver. 637. 4,397. The Arabs conquered the land of Israel. 645. 4,405. One of the Takanat Hajanim was enacted at this time. 755. 4,515. Arakjayon left Iraq for the land of Israel. 759. 4,519. Ar Yehuda became Jayon of Surah. 759. 4,519. Ahalachatidalat, B.A. Hag was written at this time. 788. 4,548. Another Takanat Hajanim 100. Who wrote in 28. 4,688. Rabbi Anusayadiah was appointed Jayon of Surah. 955. 4,715. 4 captives were ransomed at around this time. 968. 4,728. Ar-Sherer became Jayon of Pumbedita. 997. 4,757. Ar-Hai became the last Jayon of Pumbedita. 1,038. 4,798. Ar-Hai died. Academies of Babylon declined. The early Rishonim, the Crusade massacres. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1,040. 4,800. Rabbi Anujersim Meir Hagolah died. 1,088. 4,848. The rip arrived in Spain from Morocco. 1,096. 4,856. The Crusaders destroyed Jewish communities. 1,099. 4,859. Jerusalem was captured by the Crusaders. 1,103. 4,863. The rip died. 1,105. 4,865. Rashi died. And the era of the Tosafot began. 1,135. 4,895. The Rambam, Maimonides, was born. 1,144. 4,904. The first recorded blood libel took place. 1,147. 4,907. The Crusaders attacked Jewish communities. 1,147. 4,907. Rabbi Anotam was captured by the Crusaders. 1,148. 4,908. The Rambams and the Radak's families left Cordova. 1,165. 4,925. The Rambam visited the land of Israel. 1,171. 4,931. Rabbi Anotam died. 1,175. 4,935. The Rashbam died. 1,184. 4,944. The young son of the Ri was killed. 1,187. 4,948. Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem. 1,189. 4,949. Ar Yaakov d'Orleans was killed in London. 1,190. 4,950 Jews were massacred in England in the Third Crusade. 1,191. 4,951. Rabbi David Kimchi, known as the Radak, wrote his commentary. 1,194. 4,954. The Ramban, Nachmanides, was born. 1,198. 4,959. The Arayavid died. 1,204. 4,965. The Rambam died. 1,236. 4,996. Rampaging mobs massacred Jews in France. 1,242. 5,002. A massive burning of the Talmud took place in Paris. 1,244. 5,004. Jerusalem was sacked by Egyptians and Turks. 1,252. 5,000. The Inquisition began to use torture. 1,266. The Maher Amir Rothenberg was imprisoned. 1,295,050. New works advanced the study of Kabbalah. 1,295,050. The era of the Tosafot concluded at around this time. Later Rishonim. Persecutions and expulsions. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1,295,050. All Jews were expelled from England. 1,293. 5,053. The Maher Amir Rothenberg died in prison. 1,298. 5,058. The Rheinfleisch massacres began. 1,298. 5,058. The author of the Mordecai and Haggahat Maimoniyot were killed. 1,305. 5,065. The Rashba placed a limited ban on philosophy. 1,305. 5,065. The Rosh and his son, the Tur, arrived in Spain. 1,306 5,066 all Jews were expelled from France. 1,310 5,070 the Rashba died. 1,320 5,080 Jews were massacred by the Pasteros Crusaders. 1,327 5,088 the Rosh died. 1,336 5,096 Jews of Germany were massacred by the armed letter bands. 1,338 5,098 the Ralbag wrote his commentary on the Bible. 1,349 5,109 the Black Death massacre swept across Europe. 1,367 5,127 the Ran, Ribish, and other scholars in Spain were imprisoned. 1,391 5,151 Jews of Spain were massacred. Many were forced to convert. 1,391 5,151 the Ribish and Rashbats left Spain. 1,394 5,155 the final expulsion of Jews from France. 1,413 5,173 R. Yosef Albo was in a forced debate with Christians. 1,421 5,181 Jews in Austria were massacred in the Wiener Gezira. 1,475 5,235 the invention of printing was used for Jewish books. 1,481 5,241 the Inquisition was established in Spain. 1,488 5,248 R. Obadiah de Berdenoer settled in Jerusalem. 1,491 5,251 Columbus consulted R. Abraham Zacuto for his travels. 1,492 5,252 all Jews were expelled from Spain and Sicily. The great scholars of the Shul Chan Aruch and Torah Consolidation. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1,493 5,253 R. Itzhak Barbanel arrived in Naples from Spain. 1,496 5,257 all Jews were expelled from Portugal. 1,516 5,276 the Ein Yaakov was printed. 1,516 5,276 the Turks, Ottoman Empire, conquered Eretz Yisrael. 1,525 5,285 R. Yosef Yasselman saved many Jews during the Peasants' War. 1,553 5,314 a mass burning of Jewish books took place in Rome. 1,563 5,323 the Shul Chan Aruch was completed by R. Yosef Karo. 1,570 5,330 the Shul Chan Aruch was published with supplements of Rama. 1,572 5,332 the Arizal died in Tzfat. 1,570 Prague. 1,573 5,334 the Maharshal died. 1,575 5,330 Fat. 1,199 5,359 the Maharal returned to Prague again. 1,614 5,374 the Maharsha became rabbi in Lublin. 1,616 5,377 the Tosafot Yom Tov commentary was concluded. 1,621 5,382 the Shalom arrived in the land of Israel. 1,629 5,300 and Yom Tov Lipman Heller was imprisoned in Prague. 1,645 400 R. Yoel Sirks. The Bach died. 1,646 5,406 the Shach and Taz, on Shul Chan Aruch, were printed. 1,648 5,408 Jews were massacred by Shmuel Niki's forces. Early Akaranim and East European massacres. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1,016 Jews were permitted to 1,600 and Spinoza was excommunicated. 1,673 5,433 the Magen Avraham, on Shul Chan Aruch, was completed. 1,676 5,437 Shabtai Tzvi died as a Muslim. 1,689 5,449 the Beit Shmuel, on the Shul Chan Aruch, was printed. 1,698 5,458 the Baal Shem Tov was born. 1,702 5,463 the Ne'ai Yahushua's family was killed in an explosion. 1,712 5,472 the Septei Chachamim was arrested. 1,724 5,484 R. Yaakov Kulai, Miam Loizi, arrived in Constantinople. 1,727 5,487 the Mishnah Elimelech died. 1,734 5,494 Jews were massacred by the Haidamach bands. Akaranim and early Hasidim. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1741 5501 Eor Hashayim arrived in the land of Israel. 1747 5507 Ar Moshe Haim Luzito, Runkle, died in Akko, Acre. 1750 5510 Ar Jonathan Beskuts became rabbi in Hamburg. 1754 5515 Ar Yeshizkel Landau, known as the Noda by Yehuda, became rabbi in Prague. 1757 5518 The Frankists instigated mass burnings of the Talmud. 1759 5519 Frankists supported bloodline. 1700 5520 Baal Shem Tov died. 1764 5524 The Council of Four Lands, known as the Bayat Arba Herzog, was discontinued. 1768 5528 Despite resistance, the Haidamax massacred thousands. 1772 5532 The Maggid of Mazuritsk died. 1782 5542 R.N. Adler and Chatham Sofer visited the Noda by Yehuda. 1786 5546 R. Elimelech of Lizinsk died. 1791 5551 The Pale of Settlement was established in Russia. 1793 5553 Jews suffered in Reign of Terror of French Revolution. 1797 5558 The Vilna Gaon died. 1798 5559 The Bal Hadanya was released from first imprisonment. 1799 5559 Napoleon led an army expedition through the land of Israel. 1806 5566 The Judah, Arhaim Yosef David Ajalai, died. 1806 5566 The Chatham Sofer became rabbi in Prespig. 1809 5570 R. Levi Yitzhak of Berdijek died. 1810 5571 R. Nachman of Breslov died. 1814 5574 R. Akiva Eger became rabbi in Posen. 1814 5575 Koznitzer Maggid and Yehudi of Peshizka, both died. 1815 5575 Joseph of Lublin and R. Mendel of Rimano both died. 1819 5579 Anti-Jewish riots spread throughout Germany. 1827 5587 Russia began conscripting Jewish children to the army. 1840 5600 R. Yisrael of Ruzin was released from imprisonment. Later Akaranim and the Changing Society. Secular Year Jewish Year event in history. 1843 5603 The Tzemach Tzedek of Lubavitch was repeatedly arrested in Russia. 1846 5606 Sir Moshe Montefiore visited Russia to help local Jews. 1809 R. Yisrael Salander left Vilna. 1851 5611 R. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch became rabbi in Frankfurt am Main. 1859 5619 R. Menachem Mendel of Kotsk died. 1864 5624 The Malbim was imprisoned, and then expelled from Romania. 1866 5626 Judashe Harem, Tiferet Shlomo, and Tzemach Tzedek died. 1873 5633 The Chafetz Haim was published. 1874 5634 The Minchat Chinook died. 1878 5638 Petah agricultural settlement was established. 1881 5641 Many Jews began leaving Russia after a wave of pogroms. 1886 5646 R. Shlomo Gans Fried, author of Kietzer Shulchan Aruch, died. 1892 5652 R. Haim Brisker became rabbi in Brisk. 1905 5665 The Sfat Emet died. 1905 5665 Many Jews were killed in official Russian pogroms. 1911 5671 Chazanish was published. 1914 5674 Over 500,000 Jewish soldiers fought in World War I. 1918 5678 Over 60,000 Jews were killed during the Russian Revolution. 1923 5684 The Daf Hayomi study cycle commenced. 1927 5687 The 6th Lubavitcher Rebbe was released from Soviet prison. 1938 5699 Jews were attacked in the Kristallnacht pogroms in Germany. The Holocaust. Secular Year Jewish Year event in history. 1939 5699 Germany started World War II. And mass killing of Jews. 1941 5701 Nazi Germany unexpectedly invaded Russia. 1941 5701 200,000 Jews were killed at Babi Yar and Ponary. 1942 5,702 400,000 Jews of Warsaw were sent to death camps. 1943 5,703 Nazi Germany experienced massive losses in the Battle of Stalingrad. 1943 5,703 The remaining Jews in Warsaw staged a massive uprising. 1943 5,703 Jewish uprisings at Treblinka, Sobibor, and Bialystok. 1943 5,703 The Danish people quietly rescued 93% of their Jews to safety. 1944 5,704 300,000 Hungarian Jews were killed in 3 months. 1944 5,705 Uprising in Auschwitz death camp just before freedom. 1945 5,705 Nazi Germany was conquered. And World War II ended. 1945 5,705 6 million Jews were killed by the Nazis during the war. The modern state of Israel. Secular year Jewish year event in history. 1947 5,707 Publication of the Talmud Encyclopedia was commenced. 1947 5,708 The United Nations divided Israel. 1947 5,708 Arabs attacked Israel to gain territory. 1948 5,708 The State of Israel was established. 1948 5,708 Israel was invaded by many Arab countries. 1949 5,709 The War of Independence in Israel ended. 1950 5,710 All Jews left the ancient Jewish community of Iraq. 1950 5,710 Almost all Jews of Yemen emigrated to Israel. 1951 5,711 The Lubavitcher Rebbe accepts the mantle of leadership. 1956 5,717 Jewish forces invaded Egypt and conquered the Sinai Desert. 1967 5,727 The Lubavitcher Rebbe established the Tefillin campaign. 1967 5,727 Jerusalem reunited under Jewish rule in the Six-Day War. 1973 5,734 2,500 Jewish soldiers were killed in the Yom Kippur War. 1974 5,734 The Lubavitcher Rebbe established the Shabbat Candle campaign. 1982 5,742 massive enemy arsenals were discovered in Lebanon. 1987 5,746 The first international conference of Chabad Lubavitch emissaries. 1993 5,753 A secret agreement signed in Oslo. 1994 5,754 The Lubavitcher Rebbe passed away. 2008 5,767 Deadly terrorist attack at the Chabad house in Mumbai, India, kill 6. 2020 5,780 Israel signed Abraham Accords, normalizing relations with UAE and Bahrain, soon followed by Sudan and Morocco.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tchia for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or if you find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch the entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other top parasites. About the Jewish mysticism Kabbalah, and I'll be very honest, where my expertise and the 18th to the 21st century is where my gap is. You know, everyone has gaps in their knowledge, and I think it's important to acknowledge the gaps in our knowledge, not to pretend we know things we don't. And it's definitely from Hasidism forward that that's the real gap in my knowledge. Not that there's no anything, but there are certainly people out there who know a lot more than I do. In fact, I've just invited a good friend of mine to do some talks, maybe at least a talk at Congregation Tchia about Hasidism, because I really do feel like I gave it short shrift and it deserves a lot more attention, a lot more deep attention than I gave it. And so I reached out to a good friend of mine who knows a lot about Hasidism to maybe do a lunch and learn. So we'll see if that works out. But at any rate, welcome to the I would say welcome to the end, but it's not the end. It's welcome to the ellipsis, the dot. Because, of course, Kabbalah is not going to go away anytime soon. Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah is doing actually a lot better now in the early part of the 21st century than it was doing in the middle of the 20th century. In the middle of the 20th century, I would say that Kabbalah, in some ways, was at death's door, and it's doing much better now. So, in a substantial way, we're not saying goodbye to Hasidism or goodbye to Kabbalah. Rather, we're saying ... It's going to continue to grow and change. And I've heard really cool and exciting things about developments in the Haredi world, where we're in sort of new and dynamic Kabbalistic thought. And if we do end up moving to Israel-Palestine at least for a few months next year, I'm looking forward to kind of getting into that and seeing what's going on in the Kabbalistic world there in Jerusalem. Well, as we marked last time, the sort of post-Shabbatite world is, I would say that it's actually more sophisticated in many ways than the Shabbatite world. The Shabbatite world was marked by a relatively thin understanding of Kabbalah, really. And that's part of why Shabbatai study was so successful, is that people really didn't understand what was going on. They weren't really versed in Kabbalah. And when you read something of a very technical nature, you can be overwhelmed by it and very convinced by things that simply aren't really true or deep. They can sound deep, but in fact they're not. And I think that's true of a lot of things that went on in the Shabbati movement. They sounded Kabbalistic and had a Kabbalistic veneer, but if you scratch the surface even a bit, you realize that The kind of reasoning that justified the stuff that went on with Shabbatai Tzvi and Frank was, I think, pretty facile. And I think that once people actually scratch the surface of it and realize, oh, this is just, gold gilding, they abandon it pretty quickly. So the years after Shabbatai Tzvi's apostasy and after the whole business, what you get is a kind of conservative backlash in the world of Kabbalah, and that shouldn't be surprising. This whole Shabbatai business is a complete disaster. And so what ends up happening is it's kind of a closing of the ranks. That is to say, in the Kabbalistic world, after this, what people end up doing is returning to the Kabbalah much like it was in the period before Shabbatai, where things were a bit more closed off, a bit more guarded, a bit more silent, which I think is probably not always for the worst. And so the developments within Kabbalah, in fact, the developments in Kabbalah since then have been relatively conservative, which is to say, we don't see major developments outside of Lurianic Kabbalah. There's never really been a significant post-Lurianic Kabbalah. It's at some point become commentary and footnotes to Isaac Luria. And so that relatively conservative moment, that relatively conservative movement marks Kabbalah from about the mid-17th century all the way until now. And as we talked about last time, two major Kabbalistic schools developed in the aftermath of everything. One of those in Jerusalem, led by the Mizrahi Rabbi Sharabi, and another in Brody in Poland. And those two will become the central schools, so to speak, of Kabbalah, the big schools in the period after that. But of course, it's worth pointing out that Kabbalah also developed very highly technical Kabbalah in Baghdad, in Kurdistan, in Morocco, and Marrakesh was a huge Kabbalistic center. So Kabbalah continued to develop in the aftermath of the Shabbatai Tzvi business, especially in the Sephardic world, without really a hitch. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the Sephardi world was much more stable than the Ashkenazic world at that time in terms of social stability and Jewish education. But again, I think I mentioned this several times ago, that a lot of the people that were really seduced by the Shabbatian movement were people who had only recently really come back to Judaism. And so they don't really anchored in Judaism in a very profound way, in a way that, for instance, the communities in Marrakesh, the communities in Baghdad, they've been there for 1,000 years, easily 1,000 years. And so when they looked at the whole Shabbatai Tzvi thing, they were like, no. So because they had a much deeper education. So the Sephardi world was a bit less affected by the whole thing. And so it's not surprising that in Jerusalem, who never accepted the whole Shabbatian business to begin with, they excommunicated him as soon as they could, that one of the largest Kabbalistic schools in the aftermath of all of it will develop. And as I mentioned last time, the two Kabbalistic schools take very different directions. The school, Beitel in Jerusalem, is going to take the form of really intense concentration or kavanah during prayer. And that school, again, will last basically until 1969, when the last adherent of that school dies, which is amazing how long. The school lasted for hundreds of years, although very tightly guarded and very disciple-student oriented. And of course, the other is a Klois in Poland. And that is going to be largely influenced by Polish and Lithuanian Kabbalah and Jewry. And Polish and Lithuanian Kabbalah is going to be mostly remarked by its intense intellectual Kabbalistic speculation. And so out of that world is going to flow a mountain of highly intellectualized Kabbalistic systems that are going to basically try to do the work of systematizing Lurianic Kabbalah, especially vis-a-vis the old Quarter-Varan system, which I prefer. This period also saw, as I talked about last time, the rise of Hasidism. Hasidism is probably the most important, no, it's not probably, it's the most important movement in Judaism probably in the past 300 years. And Hasidism went on to spawn an entirely new system of Judaism, a new system of social relations, a new system of customs, a new system of dress. All kinds of things have come out of the Hasidic world. A whole new style of song, the Nigunim that I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, come out of the Hasidic world. And so it's from that world where we have a focus on extreme piety, but also piety that's meant to find the divine in the everyday. It's a piety in which God is lurking all about you, but you can't see God. The divine is everywhere. I think of the line from the Quran, which I can easily imagine a Hasidic Rebbe having written, where the Quran says that Allah is closer to you than your jugular vein. That image in the Quran has always struck me incredibly evocative. And I easily imagine someone like Nachman of Breslov having written something just like that. So the idea that the divine is that close to you. The obstacle is just you and your ego, or fundamentally you and your lusts and your desires. It's your desire to get rich or to have fame or to be loved by someone or whatever. It's these things that get in the way of your relationship with the divine, because the divine, of course, the Hasidic movement is right there. You just have to do the work of the tool of erasing the barriers between you and the divine. And it's in the erasure of those barriers that one can experience the divine in the everyday, including even in the movements of one's physical body, the sound of a bird. Some of the Rebbes were even alleged to be able to understand the language of the birds. They would listen to birds sing, and they said they're singing, they're having theological debates, that the Rebbes can understand the Vogelsprache, and that Vogelsprache allows them to hear the debates among the rabbis of the birds, which I always found to be a beautiful idea of sitting in the forest, listening to the birds, rather than just hearing like the rest of us, normie people that all we hear is birds. The Rebbes, they hear birds, they hear the debates about the birds, about God. And so I always found that to be a very beautiful example of Hasidism, where you're not just hearing bird sounds, you're hearing theological debates among the animal world. So again, according to the Hasidic idea, is the deep desire to experience the divine in every aspect of life, and to cleave to God. Dveikus. The dveikus is the clinging to God, and you cling to God. And the way that you do this, at some level, by cultivating a relationship with kind of shamanic character in the Hasidic world. This is the Rebbe, or sometimes there are tzaddikim, tzedukim. There are these righteous people who have a unique relationship with God. They're intensely holy. And of course, these rabbis go on to set up various courts, and those courts really operate a bit like royalty. They still do operate a bit like royalty even to this day. And so you have a loyalty to the Rebbe, to your Rebbe. And the Chassid encounters the divine primarily through the Rebbe, and it's in that Rebbe Chassid relationship that Chassidism really grows up into becoming the sort of court-like spirituality that it is today. We'll talk a little bit about how that's gotten a little stranger, especially with the Chabad Lubavitch movement, which I forgot to mention much in the later slides, which I'll need to talk about that in a little bit as well. But we'll see how that develops. So, as we stopped last time, the sort of cliffhanger from last time was that what I think that no one really realized in the aftermath of the whole Shabbatai Tzvi thing, that as much as the Shabbatai Tzvi business was a disaster, no one really saw what was happening in the background that was a bigger deal. The same year that Shabbatai Tzvi converted to Islam and apostatized was 1666, and I'm sure as many folks in the room know, 1666 is a dynamite year in the history of science. It's the year that Isaac Newton discovered or invented calculus. Discovered and invented at the same time as Leibniz. There's a bitter debate about that. It's also the same year that Newton discovered the fundamental nature of light, and also basically figured out Newtonian physics as we know it now. And he published all that in 1666. This is called the Year of Miracles. So at the same time that Newton is figuring all that out, inventing calculus and all this stuff, that's the year Shabbatai Tzvi converts to Islam. So it's difficult. I know that for many people, and for me too, when I think about Shabbatai's conversion, I think of it as a medieval thing. It's something that happened a long, long time ago. And I think of somehow Newton not having happened a long, long time ago. Newton feels very modern to me. It feels like I could just sort of, we could play chess with somebody together, like Star Trek. And they happen the same time. They happen the exact same year. And so what's coming down the pike, and what I think the Jewish world did not see in the aftermath of this entire Shabbatai Tzvi business, was the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was happening all around the Jewish world, in France, and in North America, and in England, and Holland, and Germany. The Enlightenment was developing a huge, completely new worldview that was dynamically breaking from what had come before, with its emphasis on rationality, experimental science, its emphasis on extreme logic. And so we're beginning to get philosophers like Descartes, like Spinoza. Spinoza's philosophy rejects there's a God separate from nature. It's just nature, and nature is God, and God is nature. It's the same thing. We're getting the mechanistic philosophers, the philosophers that believe that all of nature is like a giant machine. If you study it carefully, you can understand how it works. And if you understand how it works, you can predict it, and therefore you can make it do things for you. This incredibly mechanistic philosophy, which is in many ways really wonderful and in many ways I think quite bad. Inside the Jewish world, they never saw this coming. It just sort of landed on their doorstep. When I say landed on their doorstep, what I really mean is Napoleon showed up. What Hegel called the world spirit on horseback. Napoleon shows up in Central Europe and even Eastern Europe. Remember, he marched all the way to Russia. So everywhere Napoleon went, recall, he brought with him these Enlightenment ideas. His army was a sort of enlightened army, as much as armies are ever enlightened. And Napoleon brought with him the metric system. He brought with him French Revolutionary ideas. He brought with him the idea that if you're a citizen of a country, then you should have equal protection under the law. There should never be second-class citizens. Either you're a citoyen or you're not. And if you are citoyen, you have the rights and privileges of course, I'm not saying Napoleon was perfect or anything like that, but he was a big enough deal that Hegel thought at some level he represented the very movement of Geist, the very movement of God in the realization of the world. Now, of course, Hegel got disappointed with him later, but it made a big impression on the young Hegel. And so this is at the same time that the Hasidic movement is taking off. And so when these two movements come into conflict with each other, come into contact with each other, there's going to be a break-off in the Jewish world where some Jews are going to become very attracted to Enlightenment values, and they're going to incorporate those Enlightenment values into the Jewish world. And that is called the Haskalah, the Enlightenment. And I think for almost everyone here in this class, and almost probably everyone hearing my voice, all of us are pretty enticed at some level by Enlightenment ideas. The idea of equal protection under the law, you can't be just killed because of what you believe in, that we have a rational system of weights and measures, not what we do in this country, but in most countries in the world, that the scientific, the very fact that I'm talking to you through this machine is proof of the success of the Enlightenment. So for many Jews, the Enlightenment was the solution to so many problems in the Jewish world, both in terms of the inner backwardness of the Jewish world, what they thought to be a superstitious world ruled by elite dynastic rulers who divine the will of God, and who knows how they figured these things out. And they believed in werewolves and vampires, and they believed in all this stuff and Kabbalah. Many Jews were very disenfranchised with that and wanted to rush into the world of the Enlightenment, and they did. In fact, for the Jewish folks here, I imagine for many of the Jews in this class, children, great-great-great-grandchildren of the masculine, of the Enlightenment folks, because the Enlightenment was very, very successful, for better and for worse. So what ends up happening is that this new kind of rational Judaism, the integration of Enlightenment values with Judaism became, incredibly polarizing. We also, speaking again for the Jews, we live in an incredibly easy world compared to our ancestors, because in many ways we can adapt both worlds. We can be religious and we can be in the Enlightenment somehow. There was no middle ground in the 18th century. Either you jump ship and you join the Enlightenment camp, or you stayed behind in the shtetl and you stayed in the world of the pre-Enlightenment, or the traditional world, I suppose one could say. And so in the traditional world, they realized how much of a threat this was. They were to this, and they dumped on the traditional acts of the world. And so in many ways, both Enlightenment Judaism and Haredi Judaism, that is to say the black hat, ultra-Orthodox, are both actually creations of the Enlightenment. So I know that sometimes Haredi folks like to pretend as if they're the continuous line of Judaism back to Moses, and if you ask them, Moses wore a black hat and spoke Yiddish. But I guarantee you he did. The reality of modern Judaism is at some level, all of it is a response to the Haskalah. It's all a response. Either you double down on tradition and you retreated into the world of the dynastic world of the Hasidic world or the Litvish world, or you drifted off into the secular world and you tried to make a go at either becoming assimilated, or you tried to balance out both. Assimilation It's the largest, the earliest, biggest movement at some level of assimilation, right? As much as those countries that allow you to assimilate, whether it's the French, the Germans, and as you know from the terrifying history of how this will go, it will fail. Assimilation ultimately was a failed strategy. It did not protect Jews in the end. And neither did God, by the way. It wasn't like the Haredi people were protected when the first command was rolled in. And so what we have is a dualistic, a polarized world by the 1700s in which there are Haskalah Jews, and then there are traditional Jews. And the world becomes polarized. It becomes increasingly polarized. Now, that's not to say that Kabbalah stops. If all the kinds of things that have not stopped the Kabbalah hadn't stopped them, whether it was the Crusades or the Shabbat Tzvi event or whatever pogroms would have stopped the Kabbalah, well, this whole Enlightenment thing didn't stop it either. And so many of the traditional centers of Judaism in the medieval or in the early modern world, they continued to produce Kabbalah as if nothing was going on. I mean, for them, they may have not even known. And so, especially in the Hasidic world, there is a huge outpouring of literature. This is the time period where the folks in the Chabad movement, who I'm sure many folks have had contact with, they began very rigorously developing their movement. Also, it's worth pointing out that the Chabad movement becomes sort of the intellectual center in many ways of the Hasidic movement. They become much more interested in the world of the mind and the world of the intellect as opposed to just the world of the emotions. And so the Chabad movement actually becomes much more of a rigorous system of Hasidic philosophy as opposed to just singing songs and being happy or whatever. So this is a period of people like Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, which I imagine most folks have heard of. Nachman of Breslov is probably one of the most famous Rebbes of this time period. He's of course known for his deep spiritual reflections and his existential torment he experiences. He was a person of great highs and great lows. I guess most historical people who we end up remembering are kind of live in this way, and so Rabbi Nachman is known for this extreme joy and extreme sorrow. He's going to give right to the Neo, which we'll talk about in a minute. But on the Nanach movement, which I imagine if you've ever spent time in Israel, you will guys to smell as pious as they are. They wear the knit caps with Nanach written on it, and they listen to techno music and dance around. And they're generally, I don't know what the right word is, pious to a fault, something. So those guys are out there, and they're a big deal in the neo-Hasidic world. Of course, also at this time period, probably one of the most important modern Jewish philosophers and mystics is also writing. This is a Ramchal. Probably the traditional Jewish mind, the early modern period, and Luzzatto wrote a mountain of stuff. It's really, I was looking over some of it today, and I was like, my God, this guy wrote 50 books. I've probably read one or two of them. He wrote 50-something books. Enormously huge output. But the Ramchal is known as a young man for having had a spiritual experience where he had a magi, or a spiritual teacher, began to reveal him all kinds of spiritual things. He was relatively young when this happened, and you can imagine that in the aftermath of the Shabbat Tzvi business, no one wanted to hear about anyone talking to spirits anymore. And so he kind of got kicked out of Italy a little bit. He didn't quite, like I said, a ton of stuff. The way of the Lord. Derech Hashem is probably the most systematic collection or systematization of Judaism that incorporates both philosophical issues and Kabbalah into one system. Derech Hashem is a really, really great book. You can get it in Hebrew and English if you want to study it. It's a fantastic text that really does the work of combining the sort of philosophy of the day. Although the philosophy at that point is a little outdated, but it's still a very amazing book. His other major book is a book on ethics, Masila Yesharim, which is also just really, really great to read, and also you can get it in English too. And both of these books have gone on to become basically classics in the Orthodox world. There's even study sessions, so they study these books over and over and over again all through the year. So Derech Hashem and Masila Yesharim are classics of Judaism. They become classics of Judaism, and again, they incorporate Kabbalistic and non-Kabbalistic philosophical elements into one text. Again, Chaim Luzzatto is probably say he's the most important rabbi of this period. Probably the most important rabbi of this period, and so very, very important guy. Also, over in Eastern Europe, they're also continuing to do classical Kabbalah. A lot of what's happening at this point in the texts is a lot of systematization texts, which are trying to systematize the Illyrian, but also there are a lot of encyclopedic texts. So they're just going through and trying to list things, describe what things are. One is that the Hebrew language just isn't actually that good at doing it's a far better language for doing philosophy, even than English. And Hebrew is a sort of clumsy language when it comes to doing philosophy. And it's also a bit of a clumsy language when it comes to doing Kabbalah, ironically enough. And so a lot of the technical terms in Kabbalah are very, very confusing. And a lot of what happens during this time period is the encyclopedizing of Kabbalah. And one of the more famous encyclopedias that gets written at this time. One of them would love to see it. I have it downstairs. I can read it. And, they have translating it. It's beyond me. But it's a separate paper. Her name is as you may remember, are the shards left over in the process of creating the world. And those shards that are left over are actually demons. Those are the idea of all the demons. And so we systematic account of the evil detritus left over and the actually created a lot of worship. Europe doesn't go away. European anti-Semitism. Well, the anti-Semitism gets a new added dimension. As you might imagine, as Jews become more and more part of secular civil society, there's anti-Semitism that emerges at the level of discrimination of Jews in secular civil society. Of course, the most famous and infamous example of this is the Dreyfus affair in the 19th century in France. And so, with this, it was uptick in anti-Semitism and the ongoing reality of anti-Semitism. There's sort of three distinct ideas, basically, about what to do about it. One idea is the traditional idea: double down on being pious, and God will protect you. It's going to go in theory for many thousands of years, but that theory no one's given up on yet. So one is double down on being pious, and God will protect you. The other theory is that at some level, you just need to get out of Europe. Europe is just a death trap. We've been living in Europe now for 1,000 years, and for 1,000 years, it's just been a nightmare. It's just been pogrom after crusade, after blood libel, after witch hunt, after whatever. It's just that the Europeans are never going to accept us, and at some level, eventually they're going to try to kill us all. It's just a matter of time. It turns out they were right. So what do? You leave. You leave Europe. You pack your bags, and you leave Europe. And in the mid-19th century, that idea takes the form of secular Zionism. This is where Haskalah Jews, enlightened Jews, decide as a group that the situation in Europe is basically untenable and we need to leave. And this is the emergence, of course, of very, very nascent Zionism. Now, it's two things that are worth noting here about really early Zionism is that it was entirely a secular movement at first. In fact, it doesn't really get to have much religious backing until the mid-20th century, frankly. And so Zionism was a secular, largely socialist movement, although not all of it was socialist, not all of it was socialist in the way we would recognize it now. And that movement, while it did accept some messianic themes, and it was sort of apocalyptic in its narrative and in its the way it talked about the world, it wasn't really informed by Kabbalah. But I think that it was informed. If you read a lot of the language of the early Zionists, you will see a lot of the exile redemption language. You will see a lot of language that is coming in from the Kabbalah, although I think it's mostly through social osmosis, right? So, let me make that more clear, put a finer point on it. The Zionist movement early on was ever influenced by Kabbalah directly. Although, and some Kabbalistic ideas that have reached into Zionism, mostly because of sort of social osmosis, because of Jews, and they've been raised on a diet of Kabbalah and Torah. So that's one part of it. The other part of it with the Zionist movement is that from a religious perspective, it was completely remote. It was complete religious world rejected Zionism very early on. And when I say the religious world rejected Zionism, most of the religious world still rejects Zionism. It still says Zionism is a toxic, harm Palestinians, and it is irreligious. It's blasphemous. It's straight up heresy. And so this early, and even the very beginning of the Reform movement, they rejected Zionism in two major conferences. So even at the very far progressive end of the Jewish world, Zionism was very unpopular, at least to start. And it remains unpopular now, at least in the Haredi world. If folks have been watching the very wonderful show Shtisel, the soap opera, basically, you'll know in Shtisel, right, every time that they bring the Zionist up, Shulam's brother always says, he refers to the Zionism, he refers to Zionism as Shulam, the evil. He always called them the evil people. So it never became roots until much later. In fact, that in many ways, and until Ralph Cook, who we'll talk about in a minute, and it certainly wasn't until I think after the 8-Day War that, in a big way, you get religious Zionism, or you recognize it now. The Kabbalah, right? It's not like the Kabbalah stops. Slide. Oh yes, this is a mistaken slide, but there's an extra thing down here I want to talk about. This is I must have not mucked this slide up. But anyway, the last thing I want to talk about here is that in the 19th century, what also had the occult revival was a re-interest in occult sciences, alchemy, and sort of a romantic interest in that stuff. And what you get are people like Ebenezer Sibley and Barrett, who are people who published the Magus. You have a bunch of people really interested in the occult again, and this sort of occult revival that occurred primarily in the 19th century also incorporates some older elements of Christian Kabbalah, and they ultimately develop a new form of Kabbalah out of Christian Kabbalah that gets referred to as the Hermetic Kabbalah. And this is a completely non-Jewish, occult-centered version of the Kabbalah, primarily used for engaging in ceremonial magic. So we have elements of Freemasonry being combined with elements of Renaissance magic, and then that being fused together with some elements of Kabbalah, and that develops what we now refer to as the Hermetic Kabbalah, which is another third branch of Kabbalah that is developed. There's, of course, Jewish Kabbalah with a K, there is Christian Kabbalah with a C, and now this develops eventually in the in the 19th century, 20th century, into Hermetic Kabbalah with a Q. And these forms of Kabbalah continued into occult practice all the way to this day. So again, in the 19th century, Kabbalah undergoes another mutation, although not a Jewish mutation, but primarily in the non-Jewish world, primarily in England, actually, where this occult revival will take place. And so the Hermetic Kabbalah is out there, and it proves very popular. There's a whole big world of people whose spirituality is wrapped up with the very sophisticated, very complicated system of correspondence. So as I mentioned, right, just a minute ago, one of the other strategies, right, so we have one strategy, double down on being traditional. The other strategy is leave, go to Palestine or wherever. And the other strategy that I mentioned a minute ago to is assimilation. Assimilation was a very daring strategy. Perhaps I think one of the more difficult. I think many of the people, traders or something, I think it's the way we talk about that generation of folks. Assimilation was a really difficult task of trying to maintain things. It was trying to maintain being Jewish and also trying to maintain your identity in German. And be Jewish. Whatever German Jew meant. And problem was in the German, and you could do anything. The great German philosopher whose son fought in World War I and still got fired. They never could become Jewish enough. In fact, even for the anti-Semites, for the Nazis, the more that the Jews assimilated, the more dangerous they were. They were hiding among you. The thing about this, that the strategy of assimilation was always going to be at some level losing games. But what ends up happening in the academic world is that, or at least the religious world, rather, I should say, is that Judaism early on had to basically come to look like Lutheranism. They had to make a Judaism that looked as much like the Lutheranism of the 19th and 20th century as possible. And that movement became the Reform movement, right? Ethical monotheism. And if you look at the Lutheran movement and the early Reform movement, it is amazing how similar they are. Even the choir, it's just like the organs and stuff, right? If you've ever been to a classical Reform, it's like organs and the choir, and they even moved Shabbat to Sunday morning and all kinds of stuff. They were desperately trying to fit in. And again, at one level, one way of looking at it is they're trying to sell out. But again, I think that the more that you accuse them of that, you need to walk a mile in their shoes and understand how devastating the reality of anti-Semitism was at that time and how awful it would get. And at the same time, I admire them. I admire the courage it takes to try to figure out a way of being German and Jewish, being French and Jewish in a world that you basically rejected by both sides no matter what you do. I think it's very heroic and a very difficult path to march. On the academic front, part of what had to happen to justify the viability of Judaism is to justify it to the world of the theologians, and that's the theologians largely of Lutheran theology in the mid and late 19th century, which, as you probably imagine, as you may know even, German scholarship at this time was some of the most amazing scholarship in the world when it comes to the Bible. This is a time period where critical source theory was being developed. This is a time where the Bible is being systematically studied, scientifically studied for the first time. This is where Hebrew is really getting into the manuscripts of these. It's really of go. So the Wissenschaft des Judentums, the scientific study of Jewish books, was a movement in the academic Jewish world to study Jewish literature using all the modern tools at that time of German study, because they're dealing with Talmud. Why? Because the Talmud, for one, is a highly systematic, highly argumentative book based in logic. They could argue that Judaism is irrational because the Talmud is rational. The Talmud is a book of arguments driven by logic, and therefore Judaism is logical. Right? So we have the ethical components in the Hebrew Bible, and we have the logical components of the Talmud, and therefore Judaism is respectable because it's a paragon of logic. Well, guess what isn't terribly logical? Kabbalah. So, what did the Wissenschaft movement do? Ignored it. Basically pretended that it wasn't there. Why? Because it was embarrassing. It was superstition. It was occultism. It was nonsense, made up, fraudulent stuff. For them, for the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, Kabbalah was an embarrassment. It needed to be put back into the darkness of the Middle Ages because it made Jews look crazy. If you've been listening to some of the stuff I've been saying over the past 14 weeks, think to yourself, God, that sounds nuts. Well, it does sound nuts. And can you imagine a bunch of Jewish scholars presenting that to a bunch of erudite Lutheran scholars being like, yes, Judaism. We believe that God masturbated reality into existence. What? That's not going to fly, right? It's going to make them hate you. It's going to reinforce every negative stereotype about the Jews. The Jews are irrational. They're driven by superstition. They believe in nonsense. The Wissenschaft Judentum movement had to make a decision, and the decision was not Kabbalah, Talmud. And so early on, Kabbalistic literature was largely put on the back burner. And as you might know, at the same time this is happening, this is also the same time that all of the movements in Judaism are beginning to form. The Reform movement, the Conservative movement, the Masorti movement, the Reconstructionist movement begins in the early 20th century. All of the movements, even modern Orthodox Judaism, all of the movements and movement Judaism in the non-traditional Jewish world, all of them look at some level to the Wissenschaft Judentum movement, and they base their Judaism at some level on the Judaism being pumped out by places like JTS, by places like German Scholarship, by places like Cincinnati, the Reformed Seminary. And guess what? None of those places are doing. None of them are doing Kabbalah. Why? Because it's embarrassing. They do not want to look like crazy people. So the Kabbalah is totally sidelined for 2.5, 3 generations by scholars. Completely sidelined. And it's sidelined at a decisive moment in Jewish history. What is that decisive moment? The emergence of the movements. So if you grew up in a movement, the Reform movement, the Conservative movement, if you grew up in any of the movements, their scholars were simply not being trained on Kabbalah. And because they weren't being trained on it, they couldn't teach it. And because they did teach it, it was abandoned in the movements. This is the reason why, for folks who grew up, especially for folks who are a bit older than me, if you grew up in the movement Judaism world, you never heard about Kabbalah. There's a reason why. Because the rabbis you had never learned about it. And that's because the generation before them never learned about it, and the generation before them made decisions not to learn about it. And that's what happened. Effectively, Kabbalah becomes decanonized by the modern Jewish movement. Modern Judaism basically decanonizes it. So the Zohar, Sefer Yetzirah, all the literature we've talked about basically goes back on the shelf. And what comes back is Talmud, if you're lucky, but mostly Tanakh. That's the reason why you will never really see in the movements until recently studies of Kabbalah, studies of Talmud, even Talmud. I mean, for folks who grew up in the movement world, how often did you all study Talmud? How often was Talmud something that you would be encouraged to study or heard about much? Yeah, see heads shaking no. Yeah, even Talmud, right? Even Talmud was sidelined. And you can imagine, if Talmud's sidelined, then surely Zohar's going to be sidelined. So that's one part of the story. A huge part of the story is that Kabbalah didn't go away. They still did Kabbalah, studied Kabbalah in the traditional world. It's in the progressive world that it was abandoned. It was decanonized in our world. And it's only now limping back into canonization. And I think it needs to be recanonized more quickly than that. Of course, the other thing that happens, and this time, is in the mid-20th century, and there's no way to avoid the elephant in the room. It's of course the Holocaust. The Holocaust devastated, obviously, European Jewry, but in terms of Kabbalah, it really devastated the Hasidic world. And the reason why it devastated the Hasidic world, as you might imagine, is the Hasidic Jews live basically in these various tight-knit social networks. They are distinctively dressed. They look very Jewish. They have payas. They dress like Jews. Targeting them was the easiest thing in the world. They all live in the same shtetls and ghettos. So liquidating them and killing them and putting them on these cattle cars was very, very easy for the Nazis. So the Hasidic world was incredibly destroyed in the Holocaust. I think, unfortunately, and Raz would be the better expert at this than I would be, that the Hasidic world suffered apocalyptic levels of devastation in the Holocaust, just because of they were basically sitting ducks. And also their theology prevented them from leaving. So many of them, because they rejected Zionism, did not try to flee to Palestine. They thought it was religiously verboten to flee to Palestine because they were also tied to the Rebbe. They also didn't want to individually leave, right? They were tied to this person. And so if the Rebbe didn't leave, they didn't leave. And, lastly, right, they looked the part. When the Einsatz group moves in, they're there. They're living in that shtetl. And they're there with that Rebbe. And, it doesn't take but an afternoon of a really blackout drunk group of Einsatz group to do the deed to basically eliminate an entire Hasidic dynasty. And Chas v'shalom, that happened. It happened over and over and over again in Eastern Europe, especially Hungary was especially badly hit. I think 1 in 4 Satmar people were killed or something like that in the Holocaust. It's just a devastating, apocalyptic story. And as you know, the only people keeping the light on at this time, in many ways, for Kabbalah are Hasidic people. It's the people in Eastern Europe. It's the traditional people. They're the ones keeping the lights on. And with their execution by the beasts that were the Nazis, the light goes out. The light went out. It was a devastating blow to Kabbalah. Now, luckily, our Sephardic brothers and sisters, Sephardic folks, they were still doing Kabbalah in Morocco. They were still doing Kabbalah over in Baghdad. Still doing Kabbalah in Northern Africa. So it wasn't like that the devastating blow that was dealt to European Jews at the end of Kabbalah. But it is just important to say that the Hasidic movement and European Jewry was a very important center of the development in Kabbalah, and the Holocaust uniquely and profoundly destroyed some elements of that continuity. Luckily, they did survive. Many of them survived. Then they would regroup, some of them in America. And in fact, the 2 largest groups, Satmar would eventually, Satmar Rebbe, Teitelbaum eventually made his way out even before the war, or in the middle of the war. And the Babich Rebbe also made it out as well. And they refounded their Hasidic dynasties in Brooklyn, Holy Land, real Holy Land, which is Brooklyn. So Borough Park and Crown Heights, respectively. You can go visit the Holy Land. It's just right over there in Brooklyn. You folks know this, right? That Israel is just a borough of Brooklyn. So the real Holy Land is over there, just around Coney Island. So the rebound, folks. The rebound. How did this all rebound? We have the Holocaust. We have the Haskalah. We have the Wissenschaftliches Judentum movement. How did this rebound? Well, it rebounded in a couple different ways. The rebound, in many ways, began with a young maverick philologist. People forget that Gerhard Scholem. Also, people forget that he was Gerhard Scholem. He got Gershomized later when he made Aliyah. But Gerhard Scholem was a young maverick philologist who studied language. That's the reason why his scholarship is so top notch. You can read everything in the original language. And Scholem made the crazy argument that Kabbalah deserved to be academically studied. It just deserves academic. It's part of Jewish history. We need to study it. And so in the 1920s, Gerhard would do all the heavy lifting of reading basically every single Kabbalistic book that he could get his hands on in the archives. Every single one. And being the good German scholar that he was, he did that. And unlike the Wissenschaftliches Judentum movement that rejected the importance of Kabbalah, Gerhard Scholem argued convincingly that there simply was no Judaism without Kabbalah. You couldn't do it. You couldn't imagine Judaism without it. Judaism was just as important, or Kabbalah was just as important in the history of Judaism as Talmud, as anything else. So Scholem argued over the time that Kabbalah had to be reintegrated both academically and historically into the history and thinking about what Judaism was. And this was by no means easy, folks. When Scholem, who was already an established scholar at the time, was invited to speak at JTS, give a lecture at JTS at the Jewish Theological Seminary there in New York, when he was allowed to speak, the justification for him being able to speak was that, look, the Kabbalah is nonsense, right? Kabbalah is Narishkeit. Kabbalah is nonsense, but, right, Narishkeit is Narishkeit. Aber the Geschichte des Narishkeit, das ist Wissenschaft. Right? Nonsense is nonsense, but the history of nonsense is science. So Kabbalah is nonsense, but the history of Kabbalah is science. It's worth studying as historical information, but God forbid anyone be a Kabbalist. That's ridiculous. That, by the way, was coming from the most famous most famous progressive Talmud scholar in 20th century history, Saul Lieber. Probably one of the most important Talmud scholars of the early 20th century, the Talmud professor at JTS. Basically invented modern sort of quasi-secular Talmud education, Saul Lieber. That's how Sholem was introduced. Can you imagine being introduced at JTS by basically saying, yeah, what you study is nonsense, but because you study it as history, as something we used to do, it's legitimate. But God forbid anyone actually be a Kabbalist. That's completely crazy. So Sholem really had to walk an uphill battle. He fought an uphill battle the entire time to get legitimacy for what he was doing, which is unimaginable now, considering that Kabbalah is so legitimate, so mainstream. But Sholem had to fight that battle, and in many ways on his own. Luckily, he was a very capable scholar, and he was able to do it. Sholem brought with him an army of students. He attracted a great deal of students, folks like Moshe Yindel and Joseph Don, other folks who have gone on to become themselves leading scholars in the world of Kabbalah. His students were also perfectly willing to criticize him, and they did. They made careers criticizing him. Folks like Moshe Yindel really showed how important Sholem was, and also how incomplete Sholem was. And we have a whole new generations of scholars, Yehuda Leibs and Zahi Weiss and all kinds of stuff. Brody Moroz is a huge group of scholars that blow my mind with every book that they write. And so the academic study of Kabbalah is landed. It is now totally legit if you want to study Kabbalah in college. You can take an academic level Kabbalah class and no one's going to bat an eye. Sure, part of Jewish history, At the same time, there is an emerging, relatively small movement of religious Zionism, led by Rabbi Rothschild, and he would eventually give rise to religious Zionism as we know it. Although Rothschild wasn't terribly influenced by, wasn't a huge Kabbalist, but certainly a lot of the Lurianic themes of exile and redemption will play a part in the rise of religious Zionism. The most important, I think, Kabbalist to come really in the early to mid 20th century would be Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag, the Baal HaSulam, the master of the ladder. And the Baal HaSulam would make Aliyah and go to Israel, and he would compose two incredibly influential works. The most important, I think, is his commentary on the Zohar, a text that he took, I think, 10 years to write, called HaSulam, the ladder. And this is both an introduction to the Zohar, but also a commentary on the Zohar. And he translated Zohar out of the crazy Aramaic that it's in into a very modern Hebrew to make it accessible to a whole generation of people who otherwise would not be able to read it in the original Aramaic. He published it in basically modern Hebrew, modern Lashon Kodesh Hebrew. And so it's much more accessible in the modern Hebrew. So many people who read Zohar now in the Orthodox world, and also many people who study Isaac Luria are going to study many of his ideas at some level through the lens of Rabbi Yehuda Ashlag, who also developed his own sort of like interesting communist theory. There's in fact I think a kibbutz that's based on some of his ideals in northern Israel, Calvinism. So Yehuda Ashlag becomes very important. I think probably the most important character in all this. Another character that I don't mention in this that I can't believe I left out, of course, is Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, blessed memory. Schneerson, of course, was the head of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, and what's important to know about him is that, he became one of the most important founders of the Kiruv movement, that is to say, the outreach movement among Orthodox Jews and Hasidic Jews. So you ever been to a Chabad house? That's because the Rebbe sent someone to pick one, basically, at least most of them. And Menachem Mendel Schneerson founded this enormous Kiruv network of the Chabad movement. And he was just a hugely important figure in the history of 20th century Judaism. It's really hard to downplay all the really important things that he did. But one of the things that's worth mentioning here that's important, that will be important going into 21st century Judaism, is that when he died in the 90s, it was already believed in his lifetime that he was the Messiah, and then when he died, people really began to believe he was the Messiah. And so there is a movement in the Chabad world. It's not a super big movement. I don't think it's as big as it was in the late 90s. It seems to be mostly localized to Brooklyn and Israel, especially in Kfar Chabad, where they believe he's the Messiah. Also, I have a month. This is Simon. So I have, so at any rate, the Menachem Mendel was believed to be the Messiah, and I studied briefly at a Chabad yeshiva, and I definitely met people who believed that he was not only not dead, but that he had been taken into heaven somehow bodily, and that he was going to return really soon, and that his return would be heralded by Jews adopting more Torah, and that basically he was kind of occluded, and his occultation would come to an end, and the Rebbe would reappear as the King Messiah. Of course, you can still go to Crown Heights, you can still go to Brooklyn, and you can still see crowns, images of the Rebbe's flag, which has a yellow with a crown that it says Mashiach on the side. So there's this huge messianic movement, which again could be a whole class unto itself, inside of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, where they do believe that their late leader is the Messiah. And this is causing some serious problems in the Chabad movement because it is such a movement based on outreach. Although in my experience and what I've been told by folks who have grown up in the movement is that largely the kind of people that the messianic stuff appeals to are typically people like Bolsheviks who convert back to Orthodox Judaism, and younger people, but most of the more established Chabad world doesn't really get down with this Messiah stuff. Although I think they do still control 77, which is the main civic Chabad world there in Brooklyn, Mr. Parkway. So the Chabad has this messianic thing going on, which is super weird and interesting. For the folks who are in Michigan who are hanging out with me in this class, you probably have never heard about this or heard about it only briefly, because the Shem Tov family, which is the larger Chabad family here in Michigan, is a very old Chabad family. They were sitting here as Shluchim emissaries about the Rebbe way back in the 70s or 80s, something like that. But they were the leading force in many ways of the anti-Messianist movement. They really thought the Messianist movement was dangerous. And the Shem Tov family, which is very powerful here, at least in Michigan, has never been on the Messianic camp. And I don't think the Messianic camp has ever gotten a foothold in the Metro Detroit area when it comes to that stuff. That's different in other places, but I don't think that the Messianic camp has ever gotten a foothold. But go to Brooklyn, go to 770, certainly is there. All right, the last two things I guess I'll mention before we really wrap up is the rise of the Neo-Hasidic movement. As folks know, the Hasidic movement was pioneered by folks like Martin Buber, who came out of the Hasidic world but maintained a lot of, knowledge, not the right word, but wanted to sort of modernize and expand the Hasidic movement outside of the dynastic structure. And so many of the tales of the Hasidim and a lot of Hasidic spirituality became sort of exported out of the Hasidic world and then imported into the modern Orthodox world and the conservative world especially, and the Reconstructionist world most recently in the sort of the Tamara movement of the 1970s. This is a period of Karlbach and stuff like that for folks who grew up with Karlbach at the time. And so it's in that world that we have the rise of what might be called what is called the Neo-Hasidic movement. And this movement is proven to be extraordinarily popular in the Jewish world. And there are great luminaries in the Neo-Hasidic world, folks who recently passed away like Rabbi Rothschild and Art Green, who was one of Alana's teachers actually in Hebrew College. He's probably one of the premier Neo-Hasidic leader in the world right now. It's really funny at Purim that he and I got to have a few drinks together and talk about Kabbalah briefly. I feel like a great honor to be able to hang out with one of these Gaons of the Neo-Hasidic movement. And so I got to spend some time with Art Green, and I was up in Boston with Alana. So the Neo-Hasidic movement is alive and well, and I think it's popular as ever. I would say that it's actually growing in popularity. And with folks like Joe Weisenberg and other kinds of folks who are really channeling sort of Hasidic ideas into music, so I think that stuff is going to continue to be popular. The last thing I'll mention, and this is the thing I imagine some folks already know, is of course mainstream pop culture Kabbalah. The Kabbalah Center led by Rabbi Berg, which has received a lot of criticism, but whatever, I think that it's a legit form of Kabbalah as much as anything else is, at least from an academic perspective. The Kabbalah Center is they have outfits all over the world that sort of franchises kind of, and they teach a very specific kind of Kabbalah that is tailored toward celebrities, basically. Now there are non-celebrities that get into it. It's a form of sort of kind of new age meets traditional Kabbalah, but this is made famous by folks like Madonna, and I think Britney Spears was into it for a while, which I think even Britney Spears has a Hebrew tattoo on the back of her neck. Some kind of Kabbalistic tattoo. I don't know whatever sense Kabbalistic tattoos make, but you go, Brittany. So I think we sure they were home state people, so me and Brittany go back. So people like Britney Spears and Madonna also embraced Kabbalah in a pretty profound way, and apparently I think Madonna quit doing concerts on Friday night because of her commitment to certain kinds of Kabbalistic beliefs. Well, I think that the material girl's from here, right? She's from Bay City. Madonna's from Bay City. So the material girl's from here. So you have Rabbi Madonna, who has gone on to become influenced very heavily by Kabbalah at some level in her spirituality, although I don't think she never converted to Judaism. And there are many other people who've been influenced by the Kabbalah Center. Now, the Kabbalah Center is very polarizing. It's very controversial. They've got some trouble with money stuff, unsurprisingly. A religious organization gets involved with celebrities and get in trouble for money stuff. Could you believe that? So the Kabbalah, in many ways, in the 1990s and 2000s, really called pop culture, with a lot of pop culture folks, musicians, and other folks becoming really influenced by Kabbalistic ideas, and those ideas becoming very mainstream, right? Very mainstream. Folks, Kabbalah Chai. It's gonna live. Kabbalah is gonna survive us all. It's back. The Kabbalah had gone through a couple thousand years or 1,000 years now of turns and twists and messiahs, and dead messiahs, and apostate messiahs, a mountain of books and commentaries. It's really gone through, I think, almost every kind of travail a religion can go through, a philosophy can go through. No philosophy that I can think of has gone through it this much. Platonism or communism or whatever. Kabbalah has gone through so much, and it's had to transform and adapt itself. And when I think about the Kabbalah, is that I'm very happy and very glad to be alive now, because we're now living in, at some level, the golden age of Kabbalistic literature. More Kabbalistic literature is available to me than anyone else in history when it comes to accessible information. More Kabbalistic teachers are available. Secular Kabbalistic education is available. A class like this is a completely secular academic class on Kabbalah. Also, you can go to dozens of teachers of Kabbalah to become a Kabbalist. And Kabbalah is accessible to people it was never accessible before. Women, LGBTQ folks, it's accessible in a way that it never was before. And so I say that Kabbalah lives, and Kabbalah will live, because we are living in an age where the Kabbalah has finally been able to, at some level, withhold its secrets. You have to work hard to become a Kabbalist. You have to learn Hebrew, learn Aramaic, you might have to move to Israel, you have to move to Brooklyn. You have to do a lot of heavy lifting if you really want to get into Kabbalah. But you can. It's there. So much of it's on the internet. Right? So much of it you can get via interlibrary alone. You can go buy books right there on Amazon and learn secrets of the Kabbalah that would have been utterly inaccessible to 99% of the Jewish population. Most of history. And there they are, immediately available. Even English translations of things like the Zohar, with the Pritzker edition of the Zohar, massive 12-volume Pritzker edition. There was no standard English translation of the Zohar prior to that, not really. And now, for the first time in history, we have access to all 12 volumes of the Zohar, and new things are coming out every day. So we're living in a golden age for the study of Kabbalah, and we're living in a golden age for those who want to be Kabbalists. And I have to say that I'm really happy, and I feel really blessed, and I feel really grateful that all of you have decided to come along with me on this 14-week journey through the history of Kabbalah, because I feel very lucky that I have the privilege and the honor to be able to learn about Kabbalah and share what little I know, and to know that there are people interested in learning about Kabbalah and learning what little I know. And so I just want to thank all of you who hung out with me over the course of the past 14 weeks to learn some Kabbalah together, and to learn about Kabbalah and learn that this tradition is beautiful and strange and science fiction-y, just all over the place, weird and wonderful. And so I just want to express my deep gratitude for everyone who's dropped in for a class or stayed for all 14 or whatever.
What if you watched it while recording yourself at least 3 times straight? Really? Yeah, why not? If you know everything about it, yeah, I'm the fucking Kabbalist on the band.
More about Kabbalah in preparation of this class. So that's it. Thank you.
You're welcome, Doc.
Thank you.
No big deal. Yeah, it's my pleasure.
And I look forward to learning with all of you soon, whether you're Kabbalah or Kabbalah or not. I'd love to do a Zohar class. It's like my secret desire to do is to do a big Zohar class. Both study Zohar and also study about Zohar. Or we have I imagine kind of a class that would be structured like a science class where you have the lecture and the lab. Lecture would be like this, and then we have the lab. And the lab would be like studying the Zohar and just studying it. So I imagine that's my dream gig. It's a lecture lab class, the Zohar lab. Which I have to say it's a little more exciting to be in the organic chemistry lab. So the Zohar lab. So anyway, folks, that's be up to the community, up to y'all when we do that some more. But I guess again, I'll just end with saying thank you, and I'm so happy that folks have come along with me on this journey. And it doesn't end here. I will definitely say that. Like I said, we're not ending with the end of Kabbalah. We're ending with ... Because
Kabbalah is the series. You're the fucking Rothschild and not feel this fact is being adequately discussed neither here nor there nor anywhere. Bill fucking Murray was center of the universe, the fucking Rothschild was center of the multiverse. Some shit like that.
Content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and occult, magic, primitive philosophy. Consider supporting my work on Patreon or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.
Yes, are you fucking? You fine, go fuck yourself.